Hi everyone. Good to be reminded that the Jewish people take their story from this man, from Moses, the narrative of it. Let me read some quotes to you. This is what Lech Walesa, the liberator of many people in Poland, said. "There is something of the warrior in me." And William Wallace, the famous Scottish freedom fighter in the 13th and 14th century, made famous by the movie Braveheart, said, "We come here with no peaceful intent, but ready for battle, determined to avenge our wrongs and set our country free." Nelson Mandela, "You take the front line when there is danger, then people will appreciate your leadership." Gandhi in India, "You must be the change you want to see in the world." And Moses from Israel, 4000 BC, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." You see, if ever there was a liberator or leader of a people that got off to a patchy start, it was Moses. Now, if you have seen the Bible telemovie, and especially the section we just watched there, it wasn't as if Moses was fitfully dreaming at night of how he could liberate God's people. He'd been in the desert 40 years after fleeing from Egypt for killing an Egyptian, and Pharaoh had wanted him dead. By this stage, he'd been living the nomadic life of a shepherd, the concerns of the Israelites in Egypt a long way from his mind. Yet in the story, not a long way from the mind of the God of Israel. Listen to these words in Exodus, which is the narrative account of God taking his people out of Egypt from slavery to Egypt. Listen to these words in Exodus 2. "During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." Their cry came up to God, he heard their groaning, he remembered his covenant, God saw the people, God knew. Packed into a few short verses, we have 5 instances of God's attention being brought to bear on the situation, and no instances of Moses' attention being brought to bear on the situation. By the key word remember, God wasn't sort of, sitting at home watching telly for, 400 years and suddenly thought, "Oh, the Israelites, I forgot," like leaving something in the oven. I better go and resolve the problem of Israel. When it says remember, when God remembered something in the Bible, it's saying this: God is about to act to save. God didn't forget, but he is now about to act to save. And that passage that I just read to you sets the story up nicely for the events that we saw in the story of the burning bush. Now, there's nothing unusual about a bush that is burning in a desertous place. You would have to say that. We all live in Western Australia. We know what it's like. Nothing, at least, that would interest a well-seasoned shepherd. But have a look what it says in line 3 of the passage that you have before you. It says, "There the angel of the Lord appeared to him," to Moses, "in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, 'I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up.'" If you see a burning bush in the desert and it's not being consumed by the flames, there's 2 questions you can ask. And the first one is Moses' question. Why does that bush not burn up? Or a second question might spring from that if you're really sharp. That's a pretty special fire. That's a pretty special fire. Because it isn't consuming the material that it needs in order to burn, yet still it burns. Moses is immediately impressed by the former, that's a pretty special bush, but it will be the latter, a fire that needs no fuel to exist, that can burn in and of itself, that's going to be the centre of Moses' life work as you read through the Bible story. In fact, Moses' life will be consumed. It will be consumed by a God who we learn from this burning bush, like that fire that does not need any fuel. This God needs nothing, lacks nothing to exist, has everything at his disposal, and as the story progresses, we realise can save his people without anyone's help. That's foundational to the story of the Old Testament. That is, God is underived. He does not need anything to exist. He needs nothing to keep going. He does not need our help. And he can save without anyone. Yet through the leadership of Moses, God lays the template for the life of Israel right up to the coming of Jesus. And as we've heard, Jewish people today still take their story, see themselves as actors in that play, the great play that begins with Moses. And through this story, in the Bible, God is shown to be someone who can save, someone who has law or instruction, has a way that things should be done. He's a God who is known by showing himself. You can't get to know this God unless he shows himself, and that he is a provider. And those are just some of the things that Moses, as he leads the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, learns, despite his initial memorable comment, "Oh Lord, please send someone else." So a quick overview of the story so far. If you've got to Exodus, it's the second book in the Bible. And up to the point of the end of the first book, this is Genesis, this is what's happened. God's created, and then things have gone pear-shaped. Humans have rebelled against God. And God starts again with one man, Abraham, who we looked at last week. And he promises Abraham a son and descendants, more than the stars. And eventually, through the birth of a child that was miraculous, this family starts to grow. And eventually they end up in Egypt. And eventually they keep on growing. Lots of them. And that's a sign of God's promise at work. He said that Abraham's family would have a land to live in and they would have descendants. Now they have descendants, but they find themselves suddenly oppressed in a foreign land. God's promise hasn't come fulfilled completely yet. And Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is a bit worried by this growing nation, which seemed to pop out babies at the drop of a hat, and decides to oppress them. And he orders the Jewish midwives to kill the male babies when they're born, throw them into the Nile, feed them to his God, so to speak. But Moses is hidden by his parents and then is discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. You've all watched Prince of Egypt? Anyone? Eventually he's raised in the court of Pharaoh before he kills an Egyptian who is hassling an Israelite, almost a precursor to his saving and his people. But he flees and goes to the desert for 40 years. And then God remembers his people and commissions Moses to the task of bringing God's people to the promised or covenanted land. Here's the people, here's the land. Let's get those two together at a party and see how things go. That's what's going on. But lest we believe that Moses takes over from here, the words that God says to Moses right after he says, "Can't someone else do it?" are highly instructive. Because what he says is, "I can't do it, I can't speak." And God says, "Hang on, you've got a brother, he's a bit of a smooth talker. Let's get him along." And God says this to Moses, "Aaron, your brother, shall speak for you to the Israelite people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him." In other words, your brother will not speak of his own accord, only what he hears you say. And this is crucial to the story of the Bible, that Moses will only ever speak God's words. He doesn't get to come up with his own ideas of how this thing's going to play out. The story is not going to be Moses' story, it's going to be God's story. And in light of that, let's go through the story quickly, because what happens next is that defining event or narrative of Jewish people even to this day. The thing you learn from what happens to Moses in the following narratives is that God is king of his people and the world. So there's Pharaoh, who's in charge in Egypt, and the pharaohs were seen as deities at some level, versus the God of puny Israel. And Moses comes and says, "Let my people go." And the first time Moses says this to Pharaoh, he says it this way: "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh's obvious response is, "Who is that God? I'm in charge here." Right at this point, the battle line is drawn up. Who is in charge? Now, in the first week in our looking at the big story of the Bible of 2 weeks ago, we talked about the primary objection to the Bible, I think, is not that it's implausible, but that it's unpalatable. Because the primary message of the Bible is that God is king. God is in charge. And humans don't want that. And that's exactly like Pharaoh. Pharaoh is just humans writ large with a shaved head and eyeliner and, sitting on a... I wasn't going to reenact it today. But the 10 plagues that follow, because God brings plagues upon Egypt to try and convince Pharaoh that God is king, this is what happens. Pharaoh's heart gets hardened. First he hardens it himself, it seems, and then it says God hardens his heart. And each plague just seems to ratchet things up, and Pharaoh just gets harder against God. And then comes the last plague, where God strikes dead the firstborn of every family in Egypt. And he says to the Israelites, "Kill a lamb, put the blood on the doorposts and lintels of your house, because the angel of death is going to come through, and anyone without the blood on the doorposts and the lintels will suffer death in their house." Now, what do you think Pharaoh does when his son dies? Releases them, doesn't he? And then they get to crossing the sea. Now, in the series, if you see it, it's like, my goodness, it's like one of those laneways down there in the back of King Street. It's like wall of water, like this. And then the Charlton Heston 10 Commandments one's the same thing. It's probably a little bit more flexible than that, I think. It says in the passage that God caused an east wind to blow overnight that sort of parted the waters like that. So you can think of it more like it's kind of dipped. So, because if I was Pharaoh's army, I wouldn't, well, we're going in after them, I'd be saying, I don't even have my first aid certificate in swimming, I'm not going in there. So, several 100,000 people go through, and it probably doesn't take that much water to drown a fully charioted and equipped Egyptian. But that's what God does. God saves his people. His kingship is displayed. And if you go to Exodus 15, which is a song that is sung after that event, when all these Egyptian bodies are washing up on the shore, two crucial issues come through. There is no God like our God, and the Lord will reign forever. God is unique and God is king. That's the dividing line. It's not just the dividing line between Israel and Egypt, but between humans. That either humans, throughout the story of the Bible, either God is not unique and we can do what we like and how we want, and he's not king, he's not in charge. Or he is the unique God and he rules. So it's a good question to ask ourselves, isn't it? Israel sees God's salvation and is sure that God is bigger and better and must be king, therefore. And that's a hard thing in our culture, I think, to come to terms with. And perhaps it's the offensive thing for you today about Christianity, that it is so unique in that it says there is one way to God and he is in charge. He is in charge. And the second thing that follows on from that is that we only get to know that because God chooses to reveal that to us. Spirituality today that's popular is very much, I will go on a spiritual search and discover stuff about the spiritual world and God, but the Bible doesn't say that. The Western context is that we can come up with concepts and philosophies and speculations and meditation to give us a spiritual insight, but this cuts across the grain because Moses isn't out there looking for God. God reveals himself to him. When the Lord, it says in line 7, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, in that passage you've got, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. This is God searching out Moses, not Moses searching out God. And that's a crucial factor. And what it says, which you don't have written down here, Moses asks God, what's your name? No, you think, well, that's just a normal question to ask someone. But in that context, to know someone's name was to have control over them. And God's saying, well, why do you want to know my name? I am who I am, is what he says. I am who I am. Or I am that I am. I am. That's my name. So Moses can't get a hold of God and contain him. That's what God is saying to him. And that sits awkwardly in our spirituality today, I think. Like Moses, we want a certain level of control over God or our understanding of spirituality, because in a consumer context where everything is something that we purchase or we can choose, we want the option of deciding how we relate to God. But the Bible speaks very differently than that. It talks about God revealing himself and saying, here I am, and then on from that is, this leads to my next observation, we worship God the way he chooses to be worshipped. Not only can we not know him unless he reveals himself, when we do get to know him, he says, here's how it's going to be. And that is the most confronting thing probably in the Bible. It's certainly a very strong aspect that when Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life, no one comes to the Father except by me. He's not coming up with some odd idea necessarily. I mean, it looks, wow, through Jesus, that sounds out of left field for a Jewish person to think about. But he's saying the road is narrow. We don't decide how to get to God the way we want. Because we live in a culture marinated in choice, we sometimes think that's true. But here in the Moses story, right at the start, God takes his people into the desert and then says, I'm going to show you how I am to be worshipped. I'm going to show you how I am to be worshipped. And so the Moses story goes, it's off to a great start. You know, you get out of Egypt pretty quickly, and then you spend the next 40 years in the desert. That's the middle of the novel you just flick by, you know. But what happens in there is all these laws given, all these rules, regulations. Here's how you're going to build the worship system. Here's the kind of sacrifices you can do. You can't do that. You can do this. You think, come on, lighten up a little bit. What's going on? But God is teaching his people that I am worshipped the way I say, not the way you decide. And crucial to that is the giving of the 10 Commandments, isn't it? Moses doesn't sit down and speculate, let's come up with the Jewish religion. Moses meets God on the mountain and God speaks all these words to him, it says. And you get the 10 Commandments plus about 656 other laws that I can't list just at the moment. See me later. But the first 2 commands in the list of 10 Commandments are no other gods. And the second is no idols, no graven images, no other gods, no idols. And biblical Christianity bases itself on the fact that God says no other gods and no idols. It's not about speculation, it's about God saying that and that being the case. And then Moses spends a long time receiving all these instructions from God. The other thing, though, is if you read through the 10 Commandments, you think of Moses going down the mountain with the 2 tablets of stone with these things written on them. We think, is that what the commandments, no other gods, blah, 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 blah. But that's not how the commandments start. In Exodus 20, It starts this way. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. No other gods. Now, that may not seem significant, but let me give you an illustration which shows that it is. A mate and I went camping many years ago to Albany in November, and it suddenly got cold, as it can in Albany in November, and we were in a tent, and the older people in the caravan next to us were looking, said, come up and play cards and have a cup of tea. And so we did, and we were having a chat, and we got talking about religion. And the old lady said, look, I think that God's okay with me because I can keep most of the commandments. She said that. And so that God would find her acceptable. But this says something very different to what that woman believed. She believed that if I do the right thing, God will save me. Yet these commandments say the opposite. It says, I am the God who has saved you. Now, here's how to live as a saved person. She was doing the opposite with the commandments to what the commandments themselves actually say you're supposed to do. Keeping the commandments didn't result in Israel being saved. Here are 10 commandments. Keep 6 for 3 months and we'll see how we can get you out of Egypt. No. Saved, and then here's how you live. That's the guts of the story of the Bible. That God saves people not because of something they do, but he saves them and then he says, here's how to live. The New Testament says exactly the same thing, and Jesus himself said that, he and Moses, we're like that. We believe exactly the same thing. Just as Jesus said last week's talk that he and Abraham, just like that. Jesus identifies himself with these major heroes of the Bible story and says, those guys are on the same plane I'm on. And that's the point. And Paul, who's one of the New Testament writers who was Jewish, says this, for by grace, God's undeserving love, you have been saved through faith, through trusting God. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God so that no one can boast. Imagine you're an Israelite and God said, keep these 10 commandments and I'll save you. And this person said, well, I kept 8. Oh, I kept 6. Oh, I only managed 5. And we brought him and he only did 2. Boasting. The Bible story says exactly the opposite of that. Israel is saved from slavery because God loves them and saves them and had promised to Abraham that that's what he would do. And the key for us in the Bible, as we look back, is that the Jews identify themselves through that very event of Exodus from slavery, where that Passover night, God saved them. And several thousand years later, on a Passover night, God's son, firstborn, died. The angel of death visited, and the son died, so that death would pass over us. That's the point of the Bible, that salvation is a gift from God, not a wage we earn. As it was for Israel in Moses' day, so it is for us in Jesus' day. Moses may have been the prince of Egypt, but Jesus is the king of Israel, and indeed the king of the whole world. That's the story of the Bible. Let's end with a better word from Moses than please send someone else. This is what Moses said at the end of his life. As Israel is about to go into the promised land that he'd led them out of Egypt to go into, he says this, happy are you, O Israel. Who is like you? A people saved by works? No, by God, who is the shield of your help and the sword of your triumph. That's the story of Moses, that God's the hero of the story.